Good morning, and thank you all for coming out on a cold, wintry morning. I realized there were some traffic issues and bitter cold to deal with this morning, so thank you very much for being here literally or virtually by webcast. So thanks very much for being here. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. I am also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host organization for today. To say that telecommunications and internet policy have been in the news over the last year as somewhat of an understatement. Of course, as you all know, debates in the regulatory arena have embroiled this year regulators, academics, Congress, the general public, and even the president. Today, as tempting as it may be to join the cacophony of voices in that space, we're going to try and step back to take a more serious and more sober look at ways in which public policy can better inform the legislative process by sound economic principles. In particular, what we intend to do is to explore how the legislative framework for the telecommunications and internet industry might be best designed for the 21st century. Today's event is meant to be a table-setting event. It is entitled Rewriting the Communications Act, an introductory event. It will bring together over the course of 2015 various stakeholders from the telecommunications industry, students of the industry and experts, to advance the discussions that we begin today on how we might, at least with the benefits of hindsight, learn what we did right and what we have done wrong in prior legislation in this space. And then armed with those reflections, what we intend to do is to hope, anyway, to shape the discussion of how we might craft a strong, sound, and robust legislative platform for guiding the industry in the 21st century. Today, I expect that we're going to touch on a number of areas, and because there are a number of areas and a limited amount of time, what we surely will be only able to do is scratch the surface. But don't despair. We are planning other events for the year, throughout the year, that will touch on and go into deeper dives on a variety of areas, including competition, universal service, spectrum, cybersecurity, access policies, and so on. I will tell you now that our next event that we have scheduled is on March 18th, which happens to be the anniversary of the National Broadband Plan, so stay tuned and mark your calendars for March 18th, please, for what surely will be a rich discussion on the evolution of the National Broadband Plan. Let me emphasize that our goal here in this effort is not to craft legislative language, certainly not to endorse a particular or specific Democratic or Republican perspective, but rather to draw on experts from around the country who may bring valuable guidance to those folks on Capitol Hill in the administration who are entrusted to write specific legislation. Today, as I said, we're opening this discussion, and in that regard, I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Larry Downs, who is the director of the Georgetown Evolution of Regulation and Innovation Project. Larry is a prolific author in this space, a clear-eyed thinker, and a tremendous student of this industry. His bio, along with the bios of all the speakers, are in the handout that you have, so I won't belabor this. So let me, without further ado, turn it over to Larry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And good morning, everybody. We're delighted to have such a terrific turnout this morning for, as John said, our table-setting event on reconsidering the Communications Act. I can't think of a better way to have that event begin with, except other than to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor David Farber from Carnegie Mellon, who is, among many accomplishments, certainly one of the fathers of the internet, former chief technologist for the FCC, and many other achievements. But I think for me personally, this is a thrill because one of your great accomplishments was the invention of the Snowball programming language, which was the first programming language I ever learned as an undergraduate in the 1970s. So thank you for a perhaps forgotten programming language, but still, I think, a great one, and I'm sure you're great. You're quite welcome. So let's just, there's an old saying, I think former mayor of Chicago, to paraphrase, once said, Chicago isn't ready for reform yet. Would we say the same thing about the Communications Act? Is it ready for reform? Is this a good time to even have this conversation? Obviously, Congress has kicked off the discussion last year with a series of white papers on the subject. But from your standpoint as a technologist, is it the right time to have this conversation?
It's a funny time. One of my favorite sayings is, if you thought the last 25 years was wild, wait until the next 10. Because the whole field is rocketing forward much faster than I thought it would go, much faster than industry certainly thought it would go. The trouble with laws are they tend to be not sensitive to rapid changes in technology. So I'm not sure this is a good time to do a deep rewrite. I think it's probably a time when some patching is desperately in need.
So let's talk about some of that patching. I mean, what are some of the ways in which these amazing advances in technology have made the sort of the current law apply badly, whether by design or by accident?
Yeah, I think the problem, as I see it, and again, it's from a technologist standpoint. I can almost talk about law from exposure to places like EFF and Jerry Fallhaber, who I've co-authored a number of papers with, but I ain't one. So I think the problem is that they were written in a way based on technology understanding of an era that's gone. And they worked rather well in the days of telephony. They worked less well in the days of wireless. And now they just don't seem to adapt themselves to the internet world. And the internet world is not only the cable systems, but it's almost everything. And to add additional problems, the internet is international in a way that we've never seen telephony. Although telephony was international, nowhere near the rate that we have now. So we also have laws which don't harmonize in any way with laws of other nations. And that's causing problems. So I would say it's the fact that technology has outstripped our abilities to draft laws that apply. And that's why I always, when I was at the FCC, Kennard always took the attitude, which I think was correct then and maybe correct now, don't touch what you don't understand. And we didn't understand the internet then, and we probably still don't understand it now.
So if we can't, as you suggest, we can't draft laws that can keep up. It's also not the case that we're talking about a lawless regime. We have other forms of governance, like we have the engineering-driven multi-stakeholder process, and as you suggest, that's implicitly, in fact explicitly, an international process. How well does that work?
It works relatively well when governments don't get too involved. Just pragmatically, the internet space, especially, which is now the communications world, there are a lot of interest in it by national players for both economic and for control purposes, and multi-stakeholder tends to get confused right there, because on one hand, governments are trying one thing, various stakeholders are trying other things, and we're still trying to evolve a form of governance that works in that environment.
So you've said, I know that when Congress has acted, they act as if the rest of the world doesn't exist.
That's right.
In this space. how do we see that, where does that lead to problems that you can identify?
Well, some of them deal with the flow of information over national boundaries. Some deal with the economics of countries where they find some sources of income vanish because of what the technology allows to be done. Telephony now is international telephony is more and more voice over IP. Looks like packets. Countries aren't quite sure what to do with that relative to their landing and carry fees that they used to know what to do with. They don't know how to censor it. They keep putting up walls and saying, we'll block certain types of things, but in fact, the technology allows you to go around that.
Yeah.
They're abandoned.
So, John, in introducing this, rightly suggested that we're trying to talk about, the Communications Act and communications law more broadly, and trying to sort of stay away from current events. But I think there's an elephant in the room that I at least want to identify, and that's the possibility or the likelihood, as it seems, that the FCC is going to attempt this Title II gambit this week. I'm sure everybody would value hearing your view on this, and I know you have one. So,
I have a strong view on it.
Let's get that out.
Okay.
And see how it fits in.
The motivation for Title II was, quote, network neutrality issues. I would hazard an opinion that nobody understands what that means.
Which part?
Network neutrality.
Okay.
I'll argue probably that most people don't understand Title II either, but that's another story. The problem is that the Internet was never built to be neutral. In fact, one of its precepts are that there are certain streams of information that have to be given special treatment. And that's fine. You can still put that under a restricted form of network neutrality, but in fact what's being talked about now is everything has to be neutral, and that's just not technically feasible. You don't want a web query to be treated the same as a voice, because the voice has constraints on it. Jitter and latency are important, much less important as text comes up. So there are a whole set of things which just confound the simplistic view of net neutrality. I would argue one other thing, and then I'll go to another point. There's a feeling that somehow neutrality is that last mile cable or fiber or whatever your point of view is. But in fact, there are a lot of things along the line that can bias or unbias the equal treatment of even streams that have the same underlying treatment. An operating system has probably more influence on what has priority, what doesn't have priority, than any carrier's facilities. So when you talk about network neutrality issues, are you on the Title II where you have a lot of handles, are you really going to start looking at the behavior of operating systems and applications? Otherwise, I think you're living in a world that's very hazy.
And in some ways, how has Title II worked or not worked in its traditional context of the public switch telephone network? Are there any lessons from how that's happened that argue one way or the other for the Internet?
That world was a very regulated world. The Internet right now is a very unregulated world. And there are things that are regulated that probably fall more under the Federal Trade Commission umbrella than the FCC's umbrella. But there are I think it's a much simpler environment, the public telephone system. Now, I was one of the designers of the first electronic system that was put in, and I understand it fairly well. And that's a simple world compared to the Internet world. Let me go two other steps. The thing that bothers me the most with the simplistic Title II is that it calls the Internet a telecommunication system. I deal a lot with the international arena. I serve on the board of trustees of the Internet Society. And there's always been an argument for a long time that shouldn't the International Telecommunication Union be the be deeply involved in the governance of the internet. I don't like that word governance because it carries too much weight on it. Let me call it the management of the internet. And that's always been pushed off on the grounds that we're talking about information systems, we're talking about a different beast. Now suddenly the US government, who has been one of the strong arguers that the ITU should not take part, is now saying this is a telecommunications service. And I have a funny suspicion that where that's going to lead. Okay.
Tell us.
Well, I suspect there's going to be a lot of pressure from ITU to say, we regulate them. We at least have a hand in that, and you'll get a lot of agreement on that from Russia and China, who would have shown a strong interest in going that way.
Okay.
And there are other things, but I will push.
Okay. Well, that's good. Let's sort of change the subject and let's talk, because you've written a lot, especially with Professor Farber, about spectrum and about the mobile. Of course, from many standpoints, the mobile market is the internet today. It's increasingly important and the source of all the growth and a lot of the innovation. How has the Communications Act worked or not worked from your standpoint in terms of allocation of spectrum auctions, regulation of wireless? Is this an area that needs significant reform or tweaks?
Well, let me make a general comment, and then I'll go back into that one. One of the problems I've always found in my tour in Washington and my interaction with Washington is that there's a scarcity of technological understanding, and especially in the wireless arena. For a whole host of reasons, there are a lot of technologies that could be used very advantageously in making better use of our spectrum. And Jerry and I have written on that several times. And yet the regulatory process and the economic world make it very difficult to do that. And that is not the case in many other countries. So from an international standpoint, we're sort of held back by the regulatory environment, by the way we allocate spectrum, and I think that's been not as good for this country as we could have done. And I credit a lot of that to good-meaning people, but since I'm not in Washington anymore, I'll make the comment. I found that I could count the number of technologists involved in the decision-making on maybe a hand and a half. And that's a big problem when you're dealing with...
Are you talking about at the FCC or in Congress or both?
Well, let me tell you a little story, short story. Okay. I got a phone call one day when I was at the FCC, and the person said, I'm chief technologist at the Department of Justice. And I said, really? Well, it turned out he was. Janet Reno was Secretary of whatever it is. Attorney General, and she was biologist, so she could understand that. So we decided we'd have it organized, maybe a monthly meeting of the chief technologist equivalent, and we were having a hard time deciding whether we needed a 4 or 5 place table. And I think that says a lot about what's one of the big problems is that good law requires good understanding of your environment. And there are very few people who understand that at senior policy levels.
So what could we do differently as regards specifically to mobile and spectrum that would put us on a better par with countries where you think the policy has been more successful?
One way would be to experiment for real on things like spectrum, software-defined radios, which offer a lot of opportunity to make better use of the spectrum without interfering with other uses of the spectrum. The notion of listen, if nobody's using something, you sneak in and use it, but as soon as that person needs his license spectrum, you sneak out. That's all feasible. We have computing up the kazoo right now, and yet there's very little incentive to go down that direction. Because if you try to go down fairly far you bump into a very complex set of regulatory environments and ownership rules for spectrum. And I think we have to change our attitude of what it means to license spectrum. Now, I should be able to use it in a non-interfering fashion with a loose term of interference.
Okay. Let's talk about, so a lot of discussion, particularly in the last couple of years, has been about, as you say, the last mile. Let's talk about everything up to the last mile, interconnection and peering and transit and all the other backbones and so on. What should be the role of the FCC? What should be the role of Congress in that part of the internet?
Boy, that's a complex. For a long time, and it may still be the case, the FCC had real difficulties getting access to the peering agreements between the companies who run the backbones, the level 1 services, and there are a lot of them. And that made it very difficult to understand what the rules are there, what the costs are, in my view, what the reliability issues are. You know, while I may guarantee with you that I'll handle your traffic, and two of us, but you wonder whether, in fact, the network as a whole is stable because you have no idea what the agreements are, how they're executed, et cetera. That hasn't been touched by the regulatory environment, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that it would be a real difficult problem getting your hands on it.
So that's still the case that the actual agreements themselves they're private agreements. There's no legal compelling reason
That's right.
that you have to disclose them to.
We have no guarantees that, in fact, the system will survive certain failures. We sort of keep our fingers crossed.
Okay.
That's not a good way to do it.
I'm going to touch on one more topic, and then I'm going to see if the audience has a couple of questions for you as well. But one of the other things that the Congress is looking at in terms of reform of communications law is universal service. What's your view of universal service? How has that worked? What would you do differently?
I'm not an economist, so let me look at it as a taxpayer who pays a fair amount. I like the idea of universal service. I'm not sure that the pot of money has been reasonably expended. We keep adding to it, and we've in the past done things like provided internet access to high schools, right, as part of that, if I remember correctly. And yet we forget about the minor thing of maintenance on those, so a lot of them sit there with a nice plug but nothing on the other side of the plug, and if the plug stops working, no money to do things. So I don't think it's been a well thought out use of the money. My belief now is that the internet traffic doesn't carry universal service obligations.
That's right.
I suspect under Title II eventually will, which will also give a lot of users shell shock. In fact, one of the things I worry about is the shell shock as both countries and states realize that they can now tax things that they couldn't tax before, and I'm not sure I'd like to be in the middle of that one.
Well, how about from an engineering standpoint? If the goal of universal service is to broaden the base of adoption, we have network effects in the internet, so we like the idea of more voices, particularly voices that otherwise may not participate for economic reasons. Is there an engineering solution to that problem that would be better?
I think there are solutions which could be better. Looking at the whole system as a whole, not just supplying voice service, but supplying an integrated service, voice over IP, and a certain minimum data rate for an achievable amount of money that has some lifetime to it. Because the other thing you have to do is it's not just delivering the service, it's getting somebody to plug into it. And I'm not sure that you get 100% of people wanting to plug into the internet. The kids would, but not necessarily the parents.
Well, we still don't have 100% adoption of indoor plumbing either.
That's right. That's right.
Not necessarily for economic reasons, but largely.
Largely. I think that's a place for a sociologist to work. I mean, I think we can think up all the technical solutions, Ron. Let me just make one other observation.
Yeah, please.
I live in the rural countryside of Pennsylvania. And believe me, there is a rural countryside in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that always bothers me is as our communication system becomes more and more one path, like I'm using voice over IP, I get my data, I get almost everything out of a cable or fiber or whatever my particular thing is. I don't think we paid attention to the reliability of that service during times of distress like snowstorms, national emergencies. Most of the equipment we put out in the field has 8-hour battery life. And so at the end of 8 hours, you're going to potentially see, unless we do something about it, an awful lot of our citizens cut off from 911 service. I find that not very good. And I think things like that are things that should be worried about, as well as what Title II implications are and that whole mishmash.
All right, well, let me stop it there and see if we have a couple of any questions for Professor Farber from the audience before we move on to our panel discussion. But we also have a mic if you have any questions, anybody?
You did such a good job.
Here's one here. Just give us 1 second. Thank you. And please just introduce yourself so we know your name. Thank you.
Hi, Rudy Brochet with Comcast. Professor, you discussed the open internet order, at least the one that's about to be released.
Can you talk a little louder? I'm having.
Specifically on the internet, on the open internet proceeding, what's your sense of, it seems like the FCC has gone through great pains to make sure that the rules are going to apply to ISPs. I was wondering your thoughts about the broader ecosystem and the danger of whether or not the rules and the integrity of the FCC's reasoning in trying to limit the application of the rules only to ISPs and any concerns or implications you see from that.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll give my standard excuse. I'm not a lawyer. I was presented with 20 foot of rules when I arrived at the FCC, and they're sitting in a box someplace. One thing that worries me is that the chairman likes to use the word forbearance, that he sort of promises that he won't do all the things that Title II allows you to do. As far as I can tell, that's not a legally binding thing, and some future commission can decide, oh, well, maybe we should do this, maybe we should apply some of the rules that Title II allows you, like rate of return, et cetera, to the internet services. That might be good, that might not be good, but it opens up Pandora's box that we haven't had in the previous treatment of the internet. And I go back to what Kennard and I think Powell would say the same thing. We don't completely understand where that's going. And it's a goose that's laid many a golden egg for this country and the world, and the last thing we want to do is give it a poison pill.
Great. Well, thank you very much at that. I think we've scratched the surface, but I think we'll have to stop there and move on. But thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought you were telling me to.
No.
Well.
I was not trying to cut you off. Thank you. Carolyn Brandon with Georgetown. Professor, in your opening remarks, you indicated that the next 10 years is going to be unbelievably exciting. Could you give us some thoughts as to what that vision looks like from your perspective?
Yeah. For years, then I'll give you the downer, okay? There's an upper and a downer. For years, we've talked about things like virtual reality, being able to synthetically be at a meeting like this. And it's always been sort of at the edge of what we could do. But now I think we're getting very close to being able to do that. And that completely changes a huge number of things. Also, the movement from the desktop to the mobile has changed dramatically. What's available to people, to the citizens, as they use these vehicles, that's just beginning. When we get increasingly more powerful cell phones, they're not cell phones, computers in my pocket, and those computers are going to be able to at some point in the not-too-distant future, gather together the computing resources that are in the, quote, cloud, and bring an incredible amount of computing for a very brief amount of time to the problem you have as you walk around. That's revolutionary. Let me give you the other, and I could go on for hours about that. Let me give you the other side of it. We're living on top of what I like to call, I feel like I'm walking on several layers of glass with water in between them. When we did the internet initially, and many of my students were deeply involved in that as well as I, security was the last thing we worried about. We were friends. Didn't have to worry about security. And so we didn't bother with it. And now we have a critical structure that's critical to all our lives with almost no real security, meaningful security, in both the network, certainly in the operating systems, and even the computers we run on. That's going to stand up and bite us hard. That is a very difficult problem. In my personal view, the only way we're going to get around that is to reset, restart. And to reset, restart, the general public is never going to reset, restart. There's too much out there. But certainly in our critical resources, I think we have the technology to really do a reset, restart. And unless we do it, we're going to find walls falling down around us. So it's a great opportunity, but there's also some problems. And the last thing I want is regulatory mechanisms in the way of that, because we're going to have to innovate very, very rapidly. Can I say one final thing?
You can.
I will anyway. Now, a year or two ago, there was something before maybe it was more than that, before the hill of assigning to every commissioner at the FCC a technologist, somebody educated in sciences, engineering, etc. So they would have close to them somebody who understands the technology that they were asked to regulate. That didn't get very far for a whole set of reasons, as usual on the Hill. But I think that would be a major plus for the FCC and the FTC, for that matter. Now they have one chief technologist on the 8th floor, which is really the 7th floor. I won't go into that. I think what you need is one for every commissioner, because they can form a technical brain trust that could help enormously down there.
Like law clerks.
Like law clerks, only technical clerks,
Yeah.
yes.
All right. Well, with that, we do have to stop, but thank you again, Professor Farber. We've really enjoyed hearing from you.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carolyn Brandon, who's going to moderate our panel discussion. And here's your watch bag.
And please, Professor, if you're able to stay and ask questions from the audience, that would be fabulous.
Can't get rid of him that easy.
All righty, is everybody mic'd up and ready
Peter,
to roll?
No,
Peter needs his mic.
Maybe I'll have to go back then.
That's all right.
Oh, so the engineer among us is not ready.
It was out of my control. Okay, that's fine.
All right, everyone, thank you again for joining us today. And I want to quickly introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. And I think, as some of you know who have been to other Georgetown events, we very much hope to engage with you in the audience. So whether you have questions that occurred to you from the first part of our discussion or as the panel evolves, please know that we will be stopping periodically to solicit your input and questions and reactions. So really quickly, we are familiar with our very own Larry Downs. I don't need to reintroduce him. Sitting next to him is Peter Rysavy, who is president and founder of Rysavy Research. You may have read some of his work. He is one of the forerunners talking about things like 3G PPP when most people had no idea what that was. He's looking at things like 5G, and he'll explain what all these Gs mean in a minute. We have my boss, John Mayo, professor at Georgetown University. He also runs runs the Center for Business and Public Policy, which is the overseer of our project on the evolution of innovation and regulation. And last and certainly not least, we have Glenn Woroch, who has joined us from Berkeley, unfortunately not bringing us the sunny, warm weather, but an affiliate of the center, and very happy that you were able to trek across the country to join us today, Glenn. Thank you. So let us start with Mr. Larry Downs. Being from Silicon Valley, can you offer a perspective on how you see a potential rewrite of the Communications Act in all of its glory as either a catalyst or an obstacle for the sorts of innovation you're seeing from your perch in Silicon Valley?
Sure. So thank you. I think, I probably would just start by repeating everything that Professor Farber said. I think my observation is, particularly looking at innovation over the last 10 years and even over the last 20 years, is the clock speed of change for innovation just continues to accelerate. It's a function of Moore's law and a few other engineering drivers and business drivers, but I don't think anybody in this room would be surprised to hear that the pace of change in not just Silicon Valley but other technology hubs is accelerating. And that's a good thing. Of course, it generates economic value, it generates great social change, it generates innovation. In the US, it's really been a source of tremendous competitive advantage for us as a nation. So all good things come from that. The problem, of course, is that by design, the regulatory process, indeed the legislative process, is deliberative. And in most applications, that is also a good thing. We don't necessarily want to make quick decisions about free speech or search and seizure or other really important values. So those are two good things, but when they come together, we get a lot of conflict. And certainly over the last 15 years, we've just seen a growing number of places where the sort of one pace, it's sort of like having one foot in a fast-moving boat and one foot on the dock. This is not a recipe for success. So from the standpoint of innovation, I think the most important thing to recognize, as Professor Farber said, is it's not even fair to talk about keeping up with the pace of change with the law, because we can't. And we shouldn't try, because we're just setting ourselves up for failure. And so instead what we need to do are a couple things. One is, I think we have to certainly do some innovation on the regulatory process itself. I've been writing a lot recently about the FAA, which just last week issued its draft rules for drone aircraft, commercial use for drone aircraft. It's about 4 years late. Meanwhile, the industry is moving along. There's no doubt that we could do better in terms of speed with which we do regulate when we have to regulate. But I think the more important thing is to look at opportunities not to regulate. And by which I don't mean, again, as I said before, not a lawless frontier, but to rely on engineering-driven regulatory governance or management, as Professor Farber says, the multi-stakeholder process, which of course is not a perfect system of government either, but I think it's a much more appropriate system for the kinds of change we're going to see coming in the next 10 or 15 years.
What a fantastic segue you have given me. Peter, so you just heard Larry's reference to the fact that we don't need a lawless system, but clearly maybe a preference for more engineering or data-driven type of policies. From an engineer's perspective, I know you agreed very much with what Professor Farber was saying, but can you offer your thoughts as to, from an engineer, and what you see happening in the networks, wireless or wired, and the sorts of innovation you foresee coming down the pike? Where does activity in Washington stack up against that? Could it be a help? Could it be a hindrance? Is it irrelevant?
Well, it certainly can be a help, but it could also be a huge hindrance. So when we look at innovation, which you were emphasizing, I think we have to realize that innovation is multidimensional. When we first invented the internet protocols 30 years ago or so, nobody envisioned social networking as an application, and yet social networking has completely changed the way that people interact with each other. Similarly, when I first began working with wireless data technologies 20 years ago, at a time when we couldn't get anybody to recognize that this might be a useful technology, And now it's at the cornerstone of everything we do in computing. Nobody envisioned an application such as Uber, right, or ride sharing in general, and that potentially will completely transform how transportation works around the planet, right? So innovation is multidimensional, and a lot of these technologies create a platform for entirely new industries. So in that regard, where we are today with 4G technology, we have created an unbelievable communications platform. So my emphasis is mobile and wireless. So I won't talk about internet at large, but and if we could envision what 4G is, if we could see all the protocols, the billions of calculations per second being done in our digital signal processors, the complexity of the network, the entire architecture, if somehow we could see that as some edifice in the sky, it would be one of mankind's greatest creations. We can't see it, we just experience the benefits. And I completely agree with Professor Farber, we haven't seen anything yet. We've created this 4G platform, and now we're moving over the next decade or so to what people are calling 5G. We don't yet know what 5G is, but we have a lot of smart engineers around the planet with a lot of good ideas, so a lot of the pieces are starting to take shape. So as we start moving towards that future, which will be even more powerful than what we have, we rely and be able to exploit up to 10 times or more spectrum than we're using now, because we'll be able to use what are called millimeter wave bands, very, very high frequencies. As we increase the number of cell sites we have through small cell technologies, and again, we're looking at a 10x increase and ultimately a 100x increase of the number of cells that provide coverage. As our networks become more dynamic and more flexible, we will have a network by the end of the 2020s that is going to have at least 1,000 times greater capacity, at least 1,000 times greater throughput capabilities. And we don't yet know exactly how it will work. So any regulation that inhibits or constrains how we get to that future is going to have adverse consequences. So I would say the specific policies that enable that future are being able to provide greatly more spectrum in flexible ways. I completely agree with Dr. Farber on the neutrality concerns. Since we don't know how these networks will work, since we're just now beginning to use capabilities such as quality of service management, the first application of quality of service management will be voice over LTE, where voice packets and the voice signaling has to be prioritized. Similarly, there'll be a lot of other ways that we need to prioritize traffic because radio spectrum is a constrained resource. So premature rules trying to control how traffic is prioritized could have devastating consequences. So that's one specific area. Another one that gets a lot of discussion is spectrum sharing. And there are notions floating around that, well, all spectrum should be shared because we're not using it efficiently. Well, there are some scenarios where spectrum sharing makes sense, but we have to realize we're already sharing spectrum. When I'm using my phone and somebody else is using their phone, those phones are sharing spectrum, and we've spent decades building very complex protocols for devices to share spectrum. Wi-Fi is sharing spectrum. So we are sharing spectrum, but what one of the false notions is that somehow if we had heterogeneous systems all sharing simultaneously, that we could use spectrum more efficiently. Well, there are scenarios where that will work, but we have to be very, very careful in how we move forward in that direction. It is promising, but it has to be done in a very, very careful fashion. Then my final specific point would be maybe licensed versus unlicensed. We do need both, and as we move into the future, both licensed and unlicensed spectrum will play a huge role. But we have to recognize that different bands are better for different ways of using spectrum. So unlicensed use of spectrum makes sense for small cells at high frequencies. Unlicensed doesn't necessarily make sense for low frequencies, say below 1 gigahertz, because the cells are so huge at that point, or that's one of the motivations. But how do you control interference? If everybody has access to these huge cells, how do you manage that? So those are some specific items I would consider. And I'll stop rambling at this point.
Not rambling at all. In fact, I want to come back to you and unpack some of the items for those of us in the audience who are more of the English major variety as opposed to engineers. But really quick, want to jump over to the economists who are listening intently and with frowns. I think that was because they were focused. And Professor Mayo, let me just jump over you really quick to Glenn, because I think you guys are going to cover related but different aspects of this conversation. So Glenn, hearkening back to the original act, which sought to, and here I'm paraphrasing, which sought to rein in monopoly and enshrining what is called just and reasonable and non-discriminatory in the FCC's marching orders. And then you had the 1996 Act, which embraced competition as a principal goal, with unbundling of incumbent networks being the central means to enable new entry into established markets. Now that we're hearing the drumbeat from Capitol Hill and elsewhere around Washington for more innovation and to create a set of regulatory paradigms that spurs innovation, I guess the question for you is the policy of managing industry structure, including the FCC's policies to deconstruct certain markets, conducive to vibrant innovation?
A good question, if I might say so myself. Thank you for that. I don't think I am telling anyone in this audience something new when I say that the current Telecom Act is a patchwork of different bygone eras. Maybe you call it a hairball. It has gone through different eras where monopoly was prominent, turned to competition, and now we're struggling with innovation. You can see it, and we may talk about this, that there's technology silos, fixed line, wireless, cable, and satellite, and so it has anything but a uniform principle that is really guiding the policy. But one thing that seems to be pretty clear is its view of competition. And that's an old structural-based idea that high concentration leads to a lot of bad things. And one of those bad things is slow innovation or no innovation relative to the alternative. So I'm going to do a little detour here as an economist and look at that. What we know about the relationship between competition and innovation. Unfortunately, not all that much. There really is no consensus among economists that a certain industry structure, whether that be competition or pure monopoly or something in between, translates into a very innovative industry. Well, it's no surprise that the economists don't reach any consensus. But it's very much unlike Washington. It's not polarized. It's not as if you've got those that are pro-monopoly and those that are pro-competition, left-handed and right-handed economists. It's all over the map. And that part of that is because of the empirical evidence that has been brought to bear on this question is unclear. Relationships between competition and innovation activity go in all kinds of directions. Probably the most common result is an inverted U, where somewhere in between those extremes of perfect competition and monopoly, you get the peak rate of innovation. But I don't think economists can tell you where that peak is, and I don't think the FCC can tell you where that peak is. So I think that one other thing, then I'll quit, is that to add is that we really do need to bring more evidence to the question about the relationship between structure and innovation. And I think the tools are somewhat in place. It's not part of the Telecom Act, but it's part of the operating procedure of the FCC, in that they do regular competition reports on cable, wireless, broadband. They gather a lot of data, which is begging to be analyzed if it doesn't run into any kind of proprietary issues. But the National Broadband Plan generated terabytes of information, and other proceedings like the special access proceeding that has been kicked off last month. These are opportunities to really learn a lot more about this relationship between structure and innovation, that it would be a waste if we didn't take advantage of it. It'd be like wasted spectrum, wasted data.
Don't do that.
Professor Mayo, despite your youthful appearance, you have been engaged in the space called telecommunications and thinking about issues related to competition policy. So what, in your view, seems very different, if you would agree that there is a difference, in what competition looks like now versus what it might have looked like a few years ago?
So first, let me comment on the evolution of the speaking today. I thought that there was a magnificent discussion kicked off by Professor Farber and then Larry and Peter on, let's call it, the evolution of how technology might accelerate or impede our progress in a bit of an engineering and technological sense. Then what you just heard Professor Woroch do a shift to an economic domain and raise those same questions. I think what I might do is to answer your question by going backwards in time and to say, in an economic space, have we seen that same evolution of competition that has happened in a technology space that the prior speaker spoke to? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you think, actually not so long ago, I began my career, as you noted, about 30 years ago, and it was on the cusp of the AT&T divestiture, which was the largest industrial restructuring in the United States that we had since or before or since. We were in a situation where there was a tremendous amount of skepticism about whether competition would be viable and whether it would actually help consumers, whether it would actually create economic welfare. And what we had was an end-to-end network, a virtual monopoly that provided point-to-point service, and was a monopoly. And we had the divestiture, and when we had that divestiture, it was a rather remarkable event. It was remarkable because it was a very large divestiture, but it was also remarkable because it, for the first time, allowed us to begin an experiment with competition that to an economist is a great thing to be able to study, to say, here we have an opportunity to say, will competition bring consumer benefits? And for the next 12 years, from 1984 to 1996, we saw an answer unfold to that question in a resounding way, and that is that in the long-distance market, which was opened to competition, what you saw were tremendous benefits. You saw literally hundreds of competitors enter the long-distance space. You saw the prices of long-distance service fall. They fell for a number of reasons, partly because there was a reduced subsidy flow from long-distance to local, but also because of competition in this space. These are not little numbers. The price fell from about 50 cents a minute to about 5 cents a minute. There was a resounding and clear answer about whether competition in the telecommunications industry could create consumer benefits. And that led us up to the 1996 Act, which is really more of the focus of people today on Capitol Hill about what works in that measure and what hasn't worked in that measure. Let me give a shout out to it in two ways to say they did, that I think the Telecommunications Act of 1996 did a couple things exceedingly well. It also did some things that were really, really clunky, and we can maybe talk about those later. But the two things that I think it did very well is, number one, it was, let's call it the first full-throated legislative endorsement of competition. Congress embraced the prospect of competition across all of the communication space. And that, it did so in a way that in the Senate report said the purpose, the very purpose of that was to provide for a pro-competitive, deregulatory national policy framework. A pro-competitive, deregulatory national policy framework. And that helped create an aura and an environment within which firms in this space felt free to innovate, to compete, to invest. I think that was a very, very important signal to the industry. The second thing that I think the Telecommunications Act did, which also winds up being a bit of a clunky feature later, I'll maybe get a chance to talk about, but it had a very brief reference to the internet. As we all know, the internet was a very new thing at that time. The entire Telecommunications Act, 330 pages of the Act, aside from definitions, refers to the internet 6 times in one section. But what it did do was very prescient. It made a finding. It made a finding that, number one, the internet was flourishing to the benefit of the American people with a minimal amount of regulatory oversight. It was benefiting the American people. It was flourishing with a minimum of regulatory oversight. And consequently declared that it was the policy of the country, was to preserve that vibrant, free, and competitive market. And those are the words that Congress used. And to preserve that unfettered by federal and state regulation. And I think, again, that set a tone that was probably very important for creating an environment in which firms could invest, innovate, and compete. And it worked probably well for another 12 years after that. The subsequent evolution of the industry is pretty well known to people, is what Larry Downs refers to as disruptive innovation. Virtually, and Peter spoke about Uber and ride sharing disrupting the transportation sector. This industry has been transformed by the subsequent competition that has unfolded. The long distance industry, which I mentioned earlier, which had in the year 2000, 1,000 long distance competitors, was virtually eliminated. It was eliminated by the onset of people adopting wireless devices, the innovation of technology, and the innovation of business models that said we're going to price long distance service on wireless devices in a bucket. So I can call from Washington to San Francisco if I'm not at the edge of my bucket with a price of 0, a marginal price of 0. And it's really hard to compete with a price of 0. And it's been to the benefit of millions and millions of Americans to do that. The local exchange industry. The local exchange industry has been massively disrupted, the last bastion of public utility, of the public utility structure. Today, incumbent local exchange carriers only have about half the wired lines in this country. And there are almost 4 times as many wireless subscriptions in this country as there are incumbent local exchange carrier access lines. Completely unsettling the old public utility model. And I think probably the thing that has been most disruptive in this space are the things that Professor Farber, Larry, and Peter were speaking about, and that is the introduction of internet protocol-based communications, which has broadened tremendously the basis upon which firms compete. They don't compete just in voice, they compete in voice, data, and video now. And that has forever changed the nature of competition. I think in an economic space, this is a tremendously healthy thing. It's made competition more robust, more vibrant, broader. And the challenge, of course, going forward will be how to create a legislative structure that enables and promotes that continuity of innovation.
So pause there for a quick second. Larry, again, not to beat up too much that you're perched out in Silicon Valley, but what I heard Professor Mayo spell out was, what flowed from some of these, we'll call them amendments / improvements to the existing Communications Act has created an environment that I think, stirred investment and innovation and competition. Can you, from the entrepreneur's perspective, give us a sense of what is that mythical paradigm that actually is helpful to small businesses and, can we have the kids somewhere other than a garage? The kids in the basement, I'm tired of the garage reference, who has that great new idea, does not have a lot of infrastructure.
We don't have basements in California.
In California, is
That's the
that why
problem.
it's always in the
Yeah,
garage?
it's always in the garage. Sure, so I think, the phrase that comes to mind, this comes from work from Adam Thier at George Mason, is permissionless innovation. I think if you ask people in any technology hub in the United States, what's their relationship to the regulatory environment? Their first response would be, they have never thought about it, which is a good thing in many respects. They don't. When we start, to innovate, when we start to experiment, when we start to do these disruptive things, the first thing, at least in this country, we do not start by thinking, all right, who do I have to file a license with? Who do I have to get permission from? Who do I have to get clearance from? There are obviously exceptions for things like medical devices and so on. But by and large, we have operated over the last 20 years, certainly in the communications and computing space, in an environment where the innovators don't think about the regulatory environment at all until some catastrophic things happen, like a patent lawsuit that comes down from them. And that is, as John has said, is really a function, in some ways intended, in some ways accidental, of that sort of bipartisan agreement in the '96 Act to treat the internet as under a sort of a light touch regime, which has more or less held all this time. That has been probably the most valuable policy innovation that we've had in the last 100 years. Again, some of it was intentional, some of it was accidental, but it's worked incredibly well. And I think as long as the innovators don't have to think explicitly or too early in the process about what the regulatory environment is, we're going to continue to have that kind of growth.
So I think thus far the conversation has really focused on the impact and interplay of what we'll call the players in the system, the companies of across this value chain. Can I get each of you to offer some thoughts as to how you have seen, or in your opinion, how you think consumers have fared under these iterations of the regulatory structure / this era of speedier innovation, this time of disruptive change? Are they, at the end of the day, better off than they might have been than they were 15 years ago, or not? And how would you begin to capture? What are the metrics that capture what you feel is the state of the consumer? Glenn.
I'll take it. That's an easy one. Yes.
These aren't supposed to be hard.
If you look at the graphs of average pricing of whether it's broadband, whether it's cell service, not so much landline residential service, they tell the complete story. And well, actually, they don't tell the complete story. What they tell us is the story of whatever metric or common denominator you used for service. The other aspect is the quality and the usefulness of these services have increased phenomenally as the prices have tracked down according to Moore's law. So that's an easy question to answer. Yes.
So I'll say yes with an exclamation point just to be new. But to pile on a little bit, we certainly have seen prices for long distance service, for wireless service fall dramatically. The price of data has fallen by approximately 90% over even the last decade. The way that economists tend to look at consumer welfare is really, you can proxy it a couple of ways. One is by pricing, and the other is by output. What do consumers, what are they consuming? Do they like this good instead of service, or do they not like this set of goods and services? And in our case, just to take a single example, in the wireless space, we on average are spending 8 to 10 hours a month on our cell phones. That says consumers really are getting value out of those cell phones. And it's no surprise that the cell phone, and beginning really in 2007 with the adoption of smartphones, have become much broader. It's a broader vehicle and broader platform for use and consumer welfare than ever before. We can think about the benefits in our personal lives and the benefits in our professional lives. So yes, with an exclamation point.
So Peter, and here's your chance to explain why anybody should care about improvements in throughput when it comes to mobile networks. But can you, maybe from an engineer and what you've seen evolve in terms of wireless broadband capabilities at the network, I mean, how do you think consumers are faring these days?
Well, I think consumers are benefiting in many different ways. So first on pricing. When I started working in wireless technology 20 years ago, the most advanced wireless data technology was called cellular digital packet data. And it ran at an astonishing 10,000 bits per second. And now LTE runs at 10 million bits per second. So that's a 1,000-fold improvement in throughput, enabling just a vast number of applications. So between throughput and pricing, you mentioned 90% less. But in fact, CDPD 20 years ago measured, it was priced on a per kilobyte basis, 10 cents per kilobyte. That sounds fairly reasonable, except that that is the same as $100,000 a gigabyte versus $10 a gigabyte that we pay today in a typical pricing plan. So, many thousands times less expensive. And the platforms are so powerful today, the computing platforms. So it's really been this confluence of lower pricing, much higher throughputs, and unbelievable computing power, along with innovations and ease of use, touch screens. And so what has that translated to? It's translated to a picture 20 years ago when I started, when we had maybe a total of 10 different wireless data applications. Dispatch for taxis and couriers, and that was about it. And today, it's millions of applications. Look at the number of applications in these app stores. Any interest that anyone has about anything, there's an app for that. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're interested in. It's there. So I would argue that on a personal level, people's lives are greatly enriched. And then I think industry has benefited because people can be so much more productive by having access to information, being able to work in new ways from anywhere at any point.
I would be remiss if I didn't do a shout out to another of our colleagues in the audience, Anna Maria Kovacs, who has actually written quite extensively in trying to quantify and explain what some of these regulatory shifts and their impact on consumers. So if you haven't already seen her work, I encourage you to go to our website and you will find a number of her papers there. So let's turn to a topic that I know, Professor Mayo, is near and dear to your heart and certainly a key focus of the work that we do at the center, which is data-driven analysis. Professor Woroch, you mentioned that we have reams of information coming out of the Federal Communications Commission with these various reports on the state of...
Well, it's not coming out. It's there.
The reports are being published. What I often hear, certainly around town and going to academic conferences, is that the quality of the information that is being used to propel policies or upon which policies are premised is actually not that great. So commentary, what is the disconnect? Is that we're asking the wrong questions at the agency level and collecting the wrong info, or is it we're collecting the right info and it's just sitting there and not accessible for understanding?
Well, having not been inside the agencies, but I think I can still say that the second part is true, that it's there but not being analyzed. Perhaps part of it is that it's proprietary data, but I think it's as we need more engineers, we need more economists or econometricians to be able to get away from the day-to-day policy issues to pore over. It takes time. It is easy for somebody like myself to say, oh, we should have evidence-based policy. You should be able to analyze this data very carefully and dot all the I's and cross the T's, but that takes months, not the time scale and rulemaking that even rulemaking, which is so slow. So I do think having the expertise there to analyze the data is important. But the data, I think, is sitting there collecting dust on many occasions.
Let me just sort of compliment with an E, what Glenn with an I, and with an I, what Glenn was suggesting, and that is, I think there's one other thing that might help explain that disconnect that you referred to, and it does have to do with one of the rather clunky features of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and that is that while it provided for what I called a full-throated endorsement of competition, it largely brought forward a set of regulatory structures that were inherited from a public utility dimension. And so we, at the FCC, still have a wireless competition bureau and a wireline competition bureau. And whatever information is assessed is within a set of silos that are belied by the marketplace realities of consumers switching seamlessly from wireline to wireless and using wireless in droves. And so if I only am looking under my particular spotlight of wireline communications, I may be led to answers that really are rather disconnected from, to an economist's perspective anyway, economic reality.
Larry, I saw, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing in which there would probably be consensus, although I don't want to, jinx it, in terms of how the Communication Act does and doesn't work is the silos. And of course the structure of the FCC reflects the structure of the Act. That's not an accident by any means. I don't think what happened, and it would have been hard to predict, maybe not impossible to predict, is that in a time when we had individual technologies dedicated to certain kinds of content, it made sense to treat them differently. And because of the improvements in technology, now they've all converged. So everything is IP, and it doesn't matter if it's going over the cable, it doesn't matter if it's going over satellite, it doesn't matter if it's going over a mobile network. It's the same content, and consumers don't make these distinctions anymore. They watch television on a mobile device, or they watch it on a quote-unquote television set. And so the fact that we still have the agency and the Act distinguishing between these sort of combinations of technology and content that don't exist anymore is clearly a cause of at least inefficiency, if not mistakes in policy. Certainly an area where, now easier said than done, but it's clear the fix is to sort of remove those false or no longer real barriers anymore and try to regulate more holistically how you would actually implement that. There we might not have so much consensus.
So this area of holistic, I'm going to go back to that elephant that was somewhere around here when you were talking with Professor Farber, and this issue of moving away from silos, and this issue of needing speed in order to at least not impede innovation, investment, and all of the vibrant things we see happening, both technology-wise and within the consumer population and how they're interacting with the internet and this technology. Is this issue of Title II or not Title II? And it would seem, given the express language that we are aware of coming out of the FCC, that there is a desire to apply this set of regulations to a very narrow set of players in this ecosystem. I think by its terms on the fact sheet, specifically, Title II regulations would apply just to ISPs. So
facilities-based ISPs.
So the question then becomes, in a Communications Act overhaul, which we know is not going to happen anytime soon, but theoretically, if we were at a point where we were ready to actually put some legislation together, what is the best way to avoid further enshrining silos? Because it's ostensibly, in part, some of the policy conversation over the last many years around net neutrality has been about this, to recognize that we are in this interconnected ecosystem or value chain, whatever noun or adjective you want to use, and that applying regulation to one part and not the others will still have an impact in terms of all the other players, even those who are not necessarily directly subject to the regulations. So it seems as if we are poised yet again to go down this path of further enshrining silos. Any thoughts as to how, without regard to the instant vote this week, but how we would avoid this going forward? Number one. Number two, lessons learned about the effectiveness of these silos that are enshrined in regulation. Are we missing something? Do they in fact work very well? Professors.
Well, this doesn't address squarely your question, but I at least would tentatively argue that you need to organize the FCC somehow. There's got to, it can't be all one big room sitting around one big table. So you're going to have to divide it up. I would say that separating the wireless because of the spectrum issues makes some sense from the landline. Now I realize that every cell phone service works both landline and over the airwaves, but it seems like the spectrum issues separate it out, and the expertise that is I mean, that's one benefit of the silo system is you have expertise in one particular area, one particular
or not.
or not.
Professor Farber.
And so I would just say that if you have to, and somehow they've got to carve up the landscape for the commission post whatever the next Telecom Act is, that would be one division that would seem to make sense.
So I think I mentioned earlier that there were a couple of clunky features of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and I think the answer to your question partly goes back to my reference to that being clunky. I gave a compliment to the way the Act embraced the notion of a vibrant, free, and competitive market, unfettered by regulation, for the internet, and that was the marching order. That was the policy of this country. Yet there were so few mentions, and as clear as that might be, there has been a great deal of ambiguity, a huge amount of ambiguity in this country over the last dozen years, and most recently in the last, with some amount of intensity over the last year, of what can be done or what ought to be done in a regulatory space with respect to the internet. Now the reality is that internet protocol technology, whether it's wireline or wireless, is going to be is the future. So without some additional legislative guidance, I suspect that we are going to continue in this very tumultuous world that bounces between the regulatory world and the judicial world, sort of in perpetuity, without legislative guidance. So I suspect the answer really is legislative guidance on this.
I just want to comment on the ambiguity from an engineering point of view when you're, well, and from an kind of network investment point of view, when you're investing billions of dollars, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars in networks, especially moving towards 5G future, where we may end up with $1 trillion of network infrastructure globally. The worst thing we can do is have ambiguity and the inability for engineers to predict what kind of environment they're designing for. I think that has to be given significant consideration, and that applies to spectrum as well. Right now, the way spectrum has been allocated has been piecemeal, it's unpredictable, and it's very hard to coordinate your deployment of 3G, 4G, 5G, and evolving from one technology to another when you don't know, A, what the regulatory environment is, and B, what assets you have to work with.
So I have two additional questions to pose to the panel, and then I would like to take a pause and see if we've got any questions from you in the audience. So any examples from around the world of a legislative/regulatory structure in this space that any of you either have seen working very well, and explain how you define working well, or that you think has been let's say a failure, but presents some lessons for us as we are poised on this brink of rewriting Communications Act? Larry.
So I'll let others talk to the European example. I don't have the facts as close to my fingertips as others here do, but I think it is a good example of what hasn't worked in terms of investment, in terms of of deployment. I think in terms of one, I don't know if we can say it's worked, but I think picking up off of, again, the bipartisan light touch policy, that's clearly worked extremely well. And I think one model for how that might have actually reached even fuller fruition in terms of the organization of the FCC comes from Chairman Kennard's strategic plan, draft strategic plan under the Clinton administration, very forward-looking. And what he said was, look, essentially, he saw the IP revolution coming. He said these silos of contents and particular technologies don't fit anymore, or won't fit anymore in the future. And he envisioned an FCC that really was organized around the idea of promoting competition and that took action when competition failed, when there was a demonstrable market failure. So it was an FCC that moved from one that sort of had a preference for rulemaking to one that had a preference for adjudication. And where the organization, I think it might have been a much smaller agency in his mind, but instead of organized around particular technologies or particular kinds of content, was organized around the idea of promoting competition and solving competitive problems. And I think, it was just a draft plan, relatively short, but still, I would dust it off and take a much closer look at it, because I think it certainly was very prophetic in terms of its predictions about what would happen, and therefore I think deserves the opportunity to be looked at as a possible source of new design.
Any thoughts?
Larry had handed off the European things to the rest of us. I don't have the facts close at hand either, at least not recently, but I think just 2 points. Their deployment of 4G, thanks to their spectrum policy, has lagged way behind the U.S., and we can pat ourselves on the back for that. And their aggressive unbundling policy, and now I'm speaking of Europe as one big whole single regulatory agency, which it's not, but has been in part responsible for the lower penetration rates of broadband. So whatever the institutions underlying those regulations are, there's something to avoid.
So just to put your question in some perspective, I like the question. The question really is a benchmarking question. How are we doing relative to other places in the world? And for the just to promote a bit of self-promotion, a couple of years ago, I really reflected on this issue of how are we going to judge the merits of a governance structure, a regulatory structure, or a market-oriented structure. And what I came to is the notion of that has been termed results-based regulation, to ask the question, how have the results played out for us, and could we do better with turning up the regulatory dial or turning down the regulatory dial? And here, what you are led to do naturally is to ask the question that you just asked. How have different regulatory policies played out in Europe? How's the unbundling policy affected investment in Europe? And I think the data are there. Christopher, you did a very nice job in a piece comparing internationally investment patterns in Europe relative to the United States. The international comparisons are quite important. We're doing pretty well with this, have done very well in a results-based context over the last few years. The other way to think about the results-based world is to ask, how have we done sort of pre and post? And so you say, well, how have the results of a, let's call it a light touch regulatory approach, panned out for us in terms of pricing, investment, innovation, and competition over the last dozen years? And here again, I think the data are out, and you have to, at that point, begin to ask the question, do you really believe we're going to do better by turning the regulatory dial up at this juncture or down at this juncture? It's not a matter of ideology, it's a matter of practicality. And I think the data that we can look at both in the United States and in Europe and in other places will be very useful as we think about that.
All righty. Any folks clamoring to ask a question of any of our speakers? or just interested in asking a question. Yes, Professor Farber.
Actually, wait for the mic. We got to wait for it. You need his boomerang mic. We talked about the benefits to the population of all this technology, of the internet in particular. Let me put a little twist on it and ask for your comments here. One of the things we've lost is the notion of privacy, both from government and from, in a sense, from ourselves. Any comment on that?
My comment is that I think we should be concerned because we've created this network that is basically capturing everything. Anything we say, anything we post, anything we email, any place we are is becoming preserved. And I just, much as I am concerned about the security aspects that you mentioned, I'm concerned about privacy, and I think that is something we do need to attend to.
Larry, I know you've thought about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to look at privacy as a market that either is or isn't functioning. So, I have valuable information. Other people can make use of it that I necessarily can't make use of it, but they consolidate it or aggregate it or other ways slice and dice it. And I think the problem has been, from a policy standpoint, when we talk about privacy, and it's human nature, it's always a very emotional conversation. It's not a particularly fact-based or logical conversation. So I try to always use the language of, all right, is there a functioning market here? If I'm giving you information, am I getting, are there obstacles to a negotiation in which we would each get value and the parts would be, some would be greater than the parts? And I think actually, it's, you can sort of see a lot of examples where a privacy market has worked. You can think about loyalty cards for shopping. You get a discount if you let them capture the information. Most of it's been implicit. I think increasingly it's going to be explicit. But I have some confidence that we will actually turn this into a discussion that's about rational and logical questions, and that's the only way we're going to make any progress. So I'm hopeful that will happen.
I agree with that.
Yes, we have first here and then back to you. So the mic, and right here too.
Yeah, sorry, we can't see you too well.
And if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure.
Thank
My
you.
name is Mike Lindenberger with the Dallas Morning News. Good morning. The goals of the Title II discussion and the vote Thursday from the FCC chairman seem pretty clear. They want to prevent this sort of two-tiered access or mini-tiered access. And yet sort of the broader discussion of what heavy regulation means seems to have gone well beyond that, maybe with recognizing the fear that this is just the first step. I'm curious if you could talk specifically to that net neutrality concern, what impact that, in your view, would have on innovation. Would a company like AT&T have a harder time innovating in the next 10 years if it was not able to charge Netflix more or somebody else more than somebody else?
Well, I can give a specific example, which is that one of the notions in neutrality I mentioned before was quality of service management. So one of the ideas floating around right now, and something I've written about, is that if you apply quality of service management, that every similar application would have to be treated exactly the same way. But the consequences of that would be that if you imposed rules such as that, you would have to create some industry government agency that classifies applications. Any of the millions of applications out there now would have to be sorted into a bucket. There would be a whole regulatory process about, well, is this app this or this app that? Right now, an application develops an app, submits it to an app store, and a day later it's available for sale. So that's an example where you could inject a whole regulatory process for classifying applications, which I would argue would have adverse consequences. And then there's ways that would have to be monitored and controlled and so forth. So that's an example.
Yeah, as I've said exhaustively, the prioritization bugaboo is really a red herring. It's there because it sounds very good rhetorically, but in fact it's not what's really going on here. This really is about I think it's now become increasingly clear it's always been about Title II. It's always about taking us back from that bipartisan light touch regime, going back to a much more regulated regime as we had with the old PSTN network. And I think one proof of that is that obviously when engineers talk about prioritization, it's a non-event. We've had it all along. And in fact, in the 2010 Internet Order, as I counted, the FCC identified over a dozen, as they described it, non-neutral practices that were already in place and that were essential and that they were not going to regulate. I think the dangerous kind of prioritization schemes would be ones that were either anti-competitive or anti-consumer. And again, there's really, the reason we haven't seen them is because effectively they're already illegal. The Federal Trade Commission would already have had jurisdiction over those kinds of practices, and everybody knows that. So I don't think, so to answer your specific question, I don't think any ISP would be harmed by that kind of ban, because that kind of ban already exists.
I think back here.
Colin Alberts with Freedom Technologies. I guess my question specifically is in the spectrum area, and I'm wondering how accurate is it to speak of, and this is for all of the panelists, to speak of a Communications Act overhaul if we're not challenging underlying assumptions? And I'm wondering, are we going to continue with a exclusive use assumption, or start from a presumption of exclusive use of spectrum, or is where the technology seems to be taking us with small cells, with cognitive radios, with dynamic access, with all of these things, are we going to start to be able to put into legislation or policy, starting from a sharing assumption, or an assumption of shared spectrum, or even an unlicensed regime? And if we do, or is 2015 too early for policy to sort of reflect that? And are we going to have to wait for the technology to take us there?
Well, Peter, you
Yeah,
really must go first at least.
All right. So we have become very good at using spectrum kind of exclusively. Our cellular networks would absolutely not function if operators didn't have exclusive use of that spectrum. As I mentioned before, I can see scenarios where you can use dynamic spectrum allocation and cognitive radios and so forth for possibly infrequent users, light users. You can envision scenarios where sharing across heterogeneous, disparate systems makes sense. But that doesn't mean that you should apply that to all situations. If you want to look at sharing land, it doesn't make sense to have a freeway and then share that with farmers who can have the cows go across, right? There are certain applications where exclusive use will always be the preferred approach. And then there will be other scenarios where more dynamic sharing also makes sense. But we have to realize that that dynamic sharing is extremely complex. It's not something we know how to do yet. So to have a regulatory environment that makes that the norm doesn't make sense in 2015. What does make sense is to experiment with it, do it selectively, become better at it, and then over a long-term period, use it, as we become better at it. That's my opinion.
So just to follow up, I can't really speak to the technological dimensions of sharing, but I think there is an economic dimension of sharing. And right now, at least in the public sector, there's a call for sharing that is very fiat driven. We're going to dictate that various governmental agencies should share. And as good as that might be as a directive, what I might suggest is that in the private sector, when there are underutilized resources and it is valued by other parties, contracts are written every day to use underutilized resources. And to point to Peter's example, it happened in the transportation industry, it's happening in the hotel industry, and I think that some market-based incentives that could be brought to bear would perhaps be very valuable in terms of enhancing supply of spectrum that is very desperately needed in this country.
And I know your question was directed at the panelists, not the moderator, but given my experience in the spectrum world, as it were, for many, many, many years, I think what the research and the literature show, and in combination with research by Peter in particular and others that show the demand curve, and Cisco's most recent report confirms this, is that we don't have the luxury right now to pursue one versus the other path. We have to explore all options, whether you are a large company or a small company, because the demand, whether, again, regardless of who you are as a company, is in the process of outstripping supply. So it has to be we have to explore all these options. I think we have one more question, 2 questions. Go ahead. And please introduce yourself.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sorry. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Gatz. I'm the managing partner of Gat Media Holdings, my own boutique firm. I was in law school in '96 when the Telecom Act was being written, and that was a good thing for us because that meant we were going to go out into the working world with partners who were learning the same thing we were learning. It was all new. So now we're at the nexus of possibly having a new Telecom Act, a new paradigm, and a new regulatory regime. To the extent that the panel is monitoring and watching all that's going on with the FCC and the White House and the Congress and all the various different parties and things like that, what are your predictions, if you have any, as to how is this going to pan out in the end? You guys aren't soothsayers, but what do you think is going to happen in the end?
It's going to take a really long time.
Well,
But go ahead, Larry.
It's funny that you tell that story because when the '96 Act was passed, I was working in Germany for a small German telecom startup that really wanted to compete with Deutsche Telekom. And when the act was passed, I said, look, this is how we do it in the United States. We've now completely deregulated the telecom industry in one fell swoop. That's really what you guys should do in Germany too. Well, obviously the joke was on us. What I didn't realize was that the actual passage of the legislation was just the first step in the process. We've had 20 years of litigation to follow, and we're still actually arguing over the definitions of such basic things as information service and telecommunication service. So having said that, I will now this time be smarter and not make any prediction about what would actually happen if there was an act passed and how that would change the environment, because we would have to actually wait and see how the real legislating happened after it was passed.
Any other reactions?
So I'm an economist, and economists are oftentimes called upon to engage in forecast. But a very wise economist once told me never to make a forecast about anything that may or may not happen within your own lifetime. So if you'll ask me about something that will happen beyond my lifetime, I'm more than happy to forecast it, but not in the short run.
Hi, thanks. Eric Berger from Georgetown, but on the technology side, which means I've got a kind of an economic question, but there may be some technology in it as well. And now I remember where. So almost a decade ago, I was invited to this thing called the Future of Voice at the ITU. And this economist from Berkeley had some data that showed when you have 3 or more competitors in a communications market, you had high speeds and really, really inexpensive services. When you had a pair of carriers, you had modest speeds and modest prices. And when you had a single carrier, it was real expensive and crappy service. In the United States today, if you look at the 10Ks of AT&T and Verizon, they'll tell you that they're wireless companies that happen to have some wireline assets. And we have a fairly decent environment in the wireless realm. But in the wired broadband realm, it's really coming down to, if not a single national company, certainly in each market, a company. But yet, the wired broadband still has service that's 2 to 3 orders of magnitude less expensive than wireless. Do you think, as things move forward, is this something we should be concerned about? Is this something that Chairman Powell's approach, I think he was the one who said, well, we have competition across modes. Is this something that maybe a Title II type regulation could address, or do we not need to worry about it or not need to worry about it yet?
I suspect that's for me. Although I didn't present that research that you had talked about. I think that we do have to be concerned about it, and the concern is that when we do go to the next rewrite for the next generation, is that we're going to see some of the very same stuff that we've seen in the 34 Act and the 96 Act, and that is the conception of what we mean by competition. And it's basically going to be market shares, or if we get fancy, which the FCC does get at times, the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is this very structural approach. And to be a little bit more prescriptive, I think that we should be looking at what the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have done in terms of conceptualizing competition and bringing it into whatever rewrite takes place. We should be concerned about some of the outcomes that you've mentioned, but I think we would do a disservice by taking that same structural approach, because in particular in the wireless side, that a fairly concentrated industry by some people's standards has delivered remarkable service, at least in the wireline, in terms of deployment of 3G and then certainly 4G LTE, and we already talked about the plummeting prices. So it's that relationship between high concentration and innovative advanced services is just not there.
Let me just amplify what Glenn was suggesting, and that is, I'd say that we should be, as we look forward, we should be exceedingly cautious about making the same mistake going forward that we made in the past, and that is to define regulatory processes and to define markets based on a technology platform. The DOJ and the FTC, economists have a tried and true way of assessing what the breadth of competition is. It's worked in a variety of areas. As Glenn suggests, I think I would endorse that here.
So we have one last question, gentleman in the front.
Hello, panelists. My name is Virgil Young with the DC Public Service Commission. I'm a senior telecommunications analyst. Prior to that, I was at Intel in Silicon Valley in their Photonic Technologies division, and before that, I was at Corning Glass in their Photonic Technologies division. I've been reading a lot about spectrum. I'm a fiber guy, but this whole thing about 5G, I have a two-part question. One goes to technology, and the other goes to the economists. First, Peter, FirstNet is a big project that's going to be coming that involves the federal government and state and local municipalities. It's going to be using 5G, if you could speak to that. And so spectrum is going to be a big part of that. On the economic piece, I read about the Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase. He was highly critical of the spectrum policy by the FCC. And I'd like to know what your thoughts about that are, specifically about the market inefficiencies as it relates to spectrum management.
Great question, thank you.
Very quickly on FirstNet. FirstNet does not use 5G technology. It's going to use LTE, which is today's 4G technology, and that is an excellent choice because LTE it works, right? We're all using it, and not only that, operators globally have all chosen it. So it is really one global standard for technology. So for a public safety broadband network to use completely proven commercial technology from an engineering point of view is an excellent decision. Now, actually deploying the network and all the considerations of coordinating all these different groups to make FirstNet a reality, there will be logistical challenges, but from a pure technology point of view, I'm extremely enthusiastic.
With respect to the comment you made about Professor Coase, who, as you noted, won the Nobel Prize in economics, partly for his study of telecommunications markets and spectrum. He was very critical, as you noted, of the policies of the Federal Communications Commission. And this in the 1950s when spectrum was allocated across various users basically based on an application process that was completely arbitrary. It was a terrible way to assign spectrum to various users. What Professor Coase called for was the development of a set of auctions to have the federal government auction spectrum off to the highest bidder, and in so doing would collect very valuable revenues for the federal government and to assign the spectrum to the party that values it most, and to have that party in turn do what it can with that spectrum to reduce costs for consumers or to enhance the quality of services on wireless. Now, fortunately, Professor Coase's recommendation were adopted. The bad news was it took 40 years. And I hope our recommendations will come true more quickly. But in 1993, the country adopted a set of auctions for the first time in the spectrum arena. Since then, there have been dozens of auctions that have created tens of billions, well into the hundreds of billions of dollars for the federal government, and have created a massive incentive on the part of those parties that have won that spectrum to push that spectrum into the marketplace to create services, wireless services. So I think Professor Coase was spot on. In hindsight, he was one of the most influential people in this space.
Just a quick follow-up. And so that incentive auction, two parts. You got the reverse auction to clear out those 700 megahertz for FirstNet, and then that will be sold in the forward auction.
Can you repeat what I suggested?
Yes, I just wanted to lastly follow up, which I appreciate both of you saying that. So currently today we now have this 700 megahertz spectrum, which is considered the best, the cream of the crop of the spectrum, because it can penetrate buildings best, as according to my readings. So that will be currently held by television broadcasters, so we need to move them out with a reverse auction and then allocate that spectrum to the Verizons and the AT&Ts and whomever of the worlds for the forward auction. Any comments on that?
So it's actually it's 600 megahertz for the TV. 700 was the conversion from analog to digital television. So that auction already happened. The 600 megahertz band is what we're talking about for the incentive auction, and it's a very complicated sort of necessity. It's a very complicated process. It's been delayed now a couple of times, so it's not really clear. There's still some big issues left to be. We're still kind of cautiously optimistic that it will happen, but probably not on the schedule that anybody expects. But FirstNet actually, from that standpoint, it's not really all that relevant because they have their own dedicated chunk of 700 megahertz. The D block has been set aside specifically, exclusively indeed, for FirstNet. So the incentive auction doesn't really have an effect on the pace in which FirstNet gets deployed.
I just want to comment on that cream of the crop spectrum. We just completed an auction of AWS-3, 1.7 gigahertz and 2.1 gigahertz that generated an astronomical amount of revenue, $45 billion, which to me proves that all spectrum is equally valuable, and in fact the higher frequencies allow you to achieve much greater data capacities than the lower band spectrum. They each play a role, but the notion that one or the other is better is just simply not true from an engineering point of view.
Okay, now the conversation can continue in the hallway, but I am told we are being literally evicted from the room. So thank you all very, very, very much for coming, and thank you to our speakers for a wonderful conversation. And stay tuned for March 18th. It'll be at our downtown location, and if you receive the distro for this event, you're on our list to receive an invite to the next one. Thank you.